Double Supergrass. One evening in November 1985, a 14-year-old boy turned on his video to watch Top of the Pops, but saw that Crimewatch had been recorded instead. He found himself watching a reconstruction of a robbery. Gunmen were strapping a remote control device to the back of a security guard. There was no doubt in his mind that he had seen the device some months earlier. He and his mother telephoned the police. The boy was to provide the first clue in what was to become a 2.5-year police investigation that made criminal history. Broxbourne in Hertfordshire is an attractive semi-rural commuter town just north of the M25 and about 30 miles from central London. One summer's afternoon in 1985, the boy and his friends were playing near their home in Broxbourne when they saw a pile of rubbish sacks lying on the pavement by the front wall of a house. Inside, they found a face mask, false hair, glue, a small radio receiver, 200 cigarettes, and a homemade electronic device. The boy collected junk, and he took part of the contents of the bag home with him. He wore the face mask for a laugh, but it frightened his mother, and she made him throw it away. He kept the electronic device and fiddled with it for some weeks. When he stripped it down, he realized that it was a remote control device, similar to one he'd installed in a toy racing car, but eventually he threw it away. During this part of 1985, police officers from the flying squad in London were very busy. Detective Constable Kevin Shapland joined this elite group on the 1st of September. His first major inquiry concerned a robbery in Tottenham, North London, which stood out from the other cases being investigated because it was unusual and more serious. Guns were fired, hostages were taken, and a bomb was used. The robbery took place on Friday the 13th of September. Imperial Cold Stores was a hops warehouse in Tottenham. It was a windowless red brick building situated at the end of a cul-de-sac, and there were only a few deliveries each week because it was due to close at the end of the year. There was a skeleton staff of about 20, and Fred was the gateman. That morning he arrived as usual at 7 a.m. Peter, a lorry driver, was asleep in his cab in the yard. He'd driven through the night to avoid the traffic and was resting before picking up his load. Fred switched off the alarm and went into the kitchen to fill up the kettle. Suddenly he heard a noise, and within seconds a loaded gun was being pointed at the window to wait for the security van, which was due any minute. At 8 o'clock the van arrived. It was the first delivery of the day, and the driver nodded at Fred. Fred smiled back. He could do little else with a sawn-off shotgun levelled at him. The robbers demanded Fred's car keys and told him to act normally as two guards came towards the office door. As soon as they were inside, they were overpowered, and one of the guards was forced to submit as a remote control device was strapped to his back. He was ordered to take a cup of tea to his colleague outside in the van. The robbers went with him. A few minutes later, the company manager arrived. He was dragged from his car, and a warning shot was fired into the ground by his side. Having unstrapped the device from the guard and taking with them £90,000, the gunman used his car for their getaway. The police noticed a number of similarities between this robbery and 3 other attempted robberies that had taken place in Hertfordshire during the previous 6 months. On the 24th of April, at Enfield Crematorium, 3 armed men had taken staff hostage as they lay in wait for a security van to arrive. The time of delivery had changed, however, and the men were obliged to leave empty-handed. On the 3rd of May, at the Cross and Herbert pharmacy in Hoddesdon, 2 armed men held staff hostage as they waited for a security van. On its arrival, the van's crew was suspicious because everything was so quiet. They left without making a delivery. On the 27th of June, at Amtico in Enfield, 3 armed men entered a warehouse, held staff hostage, and waited for a security van. The van failed to turn up, and once again the would-be thieves were foiled. Although these were only attempts, there were a number of remarkable coincidences. First, they had all happened early in the morning. Second, the premises seemed irrelevant to the planned crime. The target was always the security van. Third, The weapons and descriptions of the offenders were all the same. It was becoming apparent that a single sophisticated team of armed robbers was responsible for these offences, and it was quite clear that they would go to any lengths to achieve their objective. Following the armed robbery in Tottenham, which received a great deal of media interest, a Crimewatch researcher telephoned Detective Constable Kevin Shapland with a view to filming a reconstruction of the crime. The item was broadcast on the 14th of November 1985. There were far fewer people watching that evening than would normally be expected, because the Miss World contest was being shown on ITV, and only 60 calls came through to the studio, compared with an average of 150. There wasn't much luck for officers back at the incident room either. The response was pretty poor. Then, 2 days after the programme, the schoolboy from Broxbourne contacted his local police station. As a matter of routine, a detective telephoned the flying squad and spoke to Detective Constable Shapland, who asked the officer to visit the boy and get him to draw the device he had seen some months earlier. If it looked nothing like the bomb they were investigating, his information could be quickly eliminated. The officer duly visited the boy and asked him to draw what he had found. Without any prompting, the boy correctly drew 4 wooden corner blocks that were inside the bomb. This was remarkable because this detail had never been released by the police. It was the first major breakthrough in the investigation. Detective Constable Kevin Shapland remembers, he was able to give us an address where the device had been found. There's no doubt that without this information we would never have looked at that house in a million years. The house, called Emerald, was in a very desirable area of Broxbourne. The police soon discovered that the owners, David and Rita Croke, had only just moved in and had no previous convictions for major crimes. However, the previous owners had moved into a considerably bigger house in Broxbourne and owned an electrical and building company in Highbury. It was this information that caught the attention of the police. Detective Constable Shapland recalls, "I was working a little bit as a one-man band at this time, pecking away at it whenever I could. There was simply not enough hours in the day to do everything. Sometimes I would sit outside the business premises in Highbury, and other days I would drive past Emerald. I couldn't sit outside the house because it was in a cul-de-sac with a dead end, so I just used to note down vehicle numbers and try to look at the people coming and going." Nearly 4 weeks after the Crimewatch reconstruction, on the 11th of December 1985, a robbery at Armourguard Security Depot in Essex added a new dimension to the investigation. Joe was a key holder and security guard for Armourguard. On the 10th of December, he finished work and arrived home in his white Lada at about 7 p.m. He opened the door and went into the living room, where he was confronted by 2 men with shotguns and balaclavas. His wife and daughter were handcuffed to the dining room table. The robbers said, "You know what we're here for. We want to take you up to the depot tomorrow and you can open the safe." One of the robbers told Joe that he had a remote-control bomb and showed him a box with a red light on top of it. He said that this would be strapped to a member of Joe's family, and if he did not carry out all their instructions, it would be detonated. Although Joe was terrified, he showed remarkable courage. He realized that there was no way out, so he decided to cooperate as far as possible with the robbers, who sat beside him throughout the night. A third member of the gang was outside the house with a radio. He kept in constant touch with his colleagues, using different code names, until it seemed to Joe that his house was entirely surrounded. As preparations were made to leave the house, Joe pleaded with the robbers to strap the bomb to him instead. He was successful. When they left the house at 5:30 a.m., the bomb was fitted under Joe's car seat. Joe's wife and 30-year-old daughter were left tied up inside the house so that they could not raise the alarm. Joe drove his car to the security depot and the robbers followed. They waited in the yard for about an hour until 2 other guards arrived, one of whom had the keys to the premises. Joe got out of his car and joined the others by the front door of the building. As they were about to go in, the robbers came up from behind, threatened them with guns, then forced them to open the door. Once inside, they tied up the guards and made them lie on the floor, while Joe was forced to open the strong room. After the cash bags had been loaded into a white Honda van, Joe and his colleagues were taken into the strongroom and the door was locked. The gunman escaped with £500,000. The bomb that had been attached to the underside of Joe's car seat turned out to be a dummy when police examined it later. For Essex police, this was the biggest robbery ever committed on their patch. Detective Constable Kevin Shapland was seconded to work with them to look for features that might link this case with his others. 2 months later, he was driving past Emerald on his way home from work, when he saw 3 cars in the driveway: an Audi GT, a Porsche and a Nissan Sunny Estate. Checks run on the latter revealed that it belonged to Dolly Ince, wife of George Ince. Dolly had previously been married to Charles Cray, brother of the Cray twins. In 1977, she married George Ince, who was escorted to the ceremony from Wormwood Scrubs Prison, where he was serving a sentence for armed robbery. This information was vital to the investigation. Why would George or Dolly Ince be at Emerald with the Crokes? The fact that their car had been spotted at the house changed the whole direction of the inquiry. The police's first hunch regarding the previous owners of Emerald was evidently completely wrong, and attention now concentrated on the present occupants, David and Rita Croke. A surveillance team began watching the house, and in particular Mr. Croke. Operation Standard was launched. David Croke was 43 and had minor convictions for shoplifting some 7 years before. His wife, Rita, was 12 years older than he, and they had been married for about 15 years. Rita had children from her first marriage. David had left school at 14 without any qualifications and had held various casual jobs driving vehicles, but he was unemployed at that time. From the middle of April 1977 until February 1985, he had lived in a council flat in Edmonton in North London. It was in February that he moved to Emerald, and he paid the purchase price of the house in cash, £85,000. The transaction was in the name of his wife, Rita. The police were immediately suspicious of the deal. Croke had no visible means of support. Detectives spent several months observing his movements, but it was not until the summer that their patience was rewarded. At the end of July, a green Golf GTI was seen in the driveway of Emerald. Its driver was identified as a well-known Supergrass called Donald Barrett, who had many previous convictions for armed robbery and had been released from prison 3 years earlier. In 1980, he was given a reduced prison sentence when he cooperated with the police and gave evidence against his co-accused in a case of armed robbery. This was a major breakthrough, because police had now identified 2 well-known armed robbers as acquaintances of David Croke. A week later, the first real signs of activity began. Mr. Barrett arrived at Emerald one afternoon in his green Golf GTI. He went inside for a short time and then came out with David Croke. They both got into the Golf and Mr. Barrett drove the car away. The surveillance team followed a little way behind. They headed towards London, went straight through the city centre and on to Battersea, south of the Thames. They passed Battersea Dogs Home on the right, then turned left off the main road into an industrial estate. The police waited outside. They watched the car drive slowly round the block and come out again. Situated in the far corner was a security depot called Shields. It specialised in the transportation of money and valuables, and police suspected that this could be the gang's next target. Observations and intelligence gleaned over the next few days seemed to confirm that it was indeed. In such circumstances, it would be normal for the police to liaise with the staff of the security depot and explain what was happening. In this case, however, events began to unfold in such a way that it was impossible for the police to alert Shields without risking the whole operation. A detective was walking past the depot one morning when he noticed a black Golf parked outside the front entrance. It caught his attention at once. He'd seen the car a few days earlier in the driveway at Emerald, and the owner had been traced. It was an Alan Turner who lived in Essex. Mr. Turner himself was observed over the next few days. He was working for Shields. but the police had no idea in what capacity. This created a major problem for the police. Not only did they not know what his duties were, but at this stage it was impossible to know whether anyone else from the company was involved with the armed team. Detective Superintendent Duncan McRae held an urgent meeting. It was obvious that the staff of Shields would be placed in some danger if the inquiry continued. On the other hand, it was equally clear that if the police aborted the operation, the robbery team would inevitably strike elsewhere, and the new target would perhaps be unknown to the police. Here at least they had some control over the situation, and given the amount of information they had gleaned already, this was too good an opportunity to miss. The police knew that they were looking at an operation in which hostages could be taken, so every move the robbers might make had to be anticipated and planned for in great detail. The first task for the police was to find a number of observation points around the industrial estate from which they could watch the main entrance of Shields unnoticed. This proved quite difficult because the depot backed onto a railway line, and the main vantage point was a pub several hundreds of yards away. However, the only way onto the industrial estate was from the busy Battersea Road, and luckily, at the junction, was an old disused police station that provided an ideal spot from which to see everything that came and went. A school in the far corner of the estate, overlooking the main yard, was another observation point. Because it was the school holidays, the caretaker was the only person in the building. Information from the intelligence teams suggested that the raid was going to happen any day now. Donald Barrett and David Croke were frequently seen together, and police assumed they were finalising their plans. Everyone was prepared for an imminent move when suddenly Mr. Barrett flew to Portugal with his family. This left officers in limbo until 2 days later, Sunday the 10th of August, when Barrett was seen to arrive back at Heathrow Airport by himself. The surveillance team followed him to Emerald in Broxbourne, where he met up with David Croke. The two men then drove to Alan Turner's house in Essex, and the police could only assume that this must be the final planning meeting. That night, the weather was atrocious. In Hertfordshire, there were violent thunderstorms that made things difficult for the surveillance team watching movements at the Croke's house. Meanwhile, in London, the armed operation was being planned, and officers from the PT-17 Blue Berets, the tactical firearms unit, were stationed around the depot in Battersea, as their skills both with hostages and with firearms were essential. Officers attached to the flying squad, skilled in mobile surveillance, were on standby in case they had to follow the robbers and arrest them elsewhere. A total of 80 officers were on duty that night, and radio silence was maintained. Detective Superintendent Duncan McRae was away, and in his absence, Detective Chief Superintendent Peter Gwynne assumed charge of the operation. The first indication that something might be happening was at 4:20 a.m, when the outside lights of Emerald were suddenly switched on. Donald Barrett and David Croke walked out of the house, got into a car, and drove down the road to a lock-up garage. They emerged a few minutes later in a different vehicle, a blue Ford Escort van. Both men were wearing dark suits and ties, and they were carrying a hold-all and a radio. They drove towards Battersea, South London. At 5:45 a.m, Alan Turner arrived for work at the depot in his VW Golf. Several minutes later, he was seen chatting to a colleague who had parked next to him. At this stage, the police still had no idea what position Mr. Turner held in the company, or whether a colleague was involved in the planned robbery. Mr. Turner looked nervous. He was pacing up and down, smoking heavily. About 10 minutes later, the blue escort van, driven by Mr. Barrett and Mr. Croke, entered the industrial estate. Immediately in front of them was the key holder of Shields, driving a Vauxhall car, quite unaware that he was being followed. Both vehicles were heading for the security depot. The Vauxhall stopped outside the gates, and the driver got out to greet Mr. Turner and his colleague. The blue van drove slowly towards them. The police thought that this was going to be the moment of attack. Instead of stopping, however, the blue van drove out of the estate into a street nearby, where it parked. Meanwhile, back at Shields, Mr. Turner and his colleague had gone inside with the key holder. They emerged a few minutes later, and Mr. Turner walked towards a white security van parked by the main gates, carrying something that resembled a shoebox. He opened the back door of the van and placed the box inside. Then he and his colleague jumped into the van and he started up the engine. Suddenly the police realized that Mr. Turner was in fact a security guard. As he reversed the van out of the yard and drove away, their worst fear materialized. The robber's target was not Shields after all. Detective Chief Superintendent Peter Gwynn recalls, "We now had a real problem because we had a vehicle with perhaps a considerable amount of commodity on board, money, cash, gold, and 2 armed robbers in the vicinity. The only thing I could do was employ what vehicles I had in the area to follow the vehicle. These, of course, were very few, as the depot had been assumed to be the robbers' target. 99% of Gwynn's team were surrounding that building, and it would have been impossible for them to move from their present positions without alerting the whole neighbourhood." However, Detective Constable Kevin Shapland was part of the authorised firearms team, and as his observation point overlooked the main road, it was easy for him and a colleague to leap into a car and provide backup for the surveillance crew. Detective Constable Shapland remembers, "All the plans we'd made had gone. We didn't know where we were going, we didn't know what Turner was carrying in the shoebox, and we had no idea where this was going to end." The blue Ford van with Barrett and Croke in it followed the security van, and we were some distance behind. Barrett was wearing a wig and glasses. It was a bit frightening because we knew they were likely to be armed, and the situation could be very dangerous. The convoy went round Hyde Park Corner and up the Edgware Road onto the M1 motorway. As a matter of urgency, command of the police operation was switched to the officer leading the surveillance team. When police officers go outside their own areas with guns, strict procedures have to be followed. In normal circumstances, only assistant chief constables and those above them can authorise officers carrying weapons to enter the operational area of another county force. In this case, because events were moving so quickly and the police had no idea where they were going, county forces had to be alerted to the situation as the team drove through different counties. The Metropolitan Police helicopter had been put on standby and was waiting at the Battersea heliport. Once the robbers had driven out of the area, the helicopter was called to assist, and it followed the convoy about 2 miles behind the vehicles. It's equipped with a radio that enables it to link up instantly with any police force. On this occasion, it could also monitor the radio transmissions from the surveillance team. This was to prove invaluable, because the helicopter was able to relay what was happening almost instantaneously, both to the headquarters of each county's police force and to New Scotland Yard. The convoy had been travelling for less than an hour when the white security van suddenly pulled off the motorway into the service station at Newport Pagnell. It was followed closely by the blue Ford van. It was now 7:45 a.m. Mr. Turner parked the security van, got out and made his way towards the restaurant. The surveillance cars parked outside the service area on the hard shoulder so as not to alert the suspects. They could see Mr. Croke and Mr. Barrett talking to Mr. Turner outside the main entrance. It looked as though the meeting had been pre-arranged. Turner walked back to the security van, followed by Croke and Barrett. It seemed that something was about to happen, but the police could not see the van clearly and could not risk moving nearer. Moreover, these suspects had previously taken hostages, fired guns, and used explosive devices. The car park was full of potential hostages with their vehicles, so the police decided not to attempt any arrests until such time as the robbery had taken place, unless danger to life dictated otherwise. The white security van was next seen leaving the car park, heading towards the motorway. Only now David Croke, not Alan Turner, was at the wheel, and Donald Barrett was on his own, following them closely in the blue Ford van. It seemed that the robbers had taken charge. There was no sign of either guard. Something had obviously happened, and the police now had to act. Officers knew that their best point of attack was the slip road leading back onto the motorway, but the timing was crucial. Any confrontation on the motorway itself could be fatal. As the two vans made their way towards the motorway, the attack signal was given. The surveillance vehicles, earlier parked on the hard shoulder, raced up the slip road in a hair-raising chase and caught up with the vans just as they were trying to rejoin the traffic on the M1. They forced the white van onto the near-side grass verge, and within seconds, officers with drawn firearms had pulled David Croke out. When he moved his hand towards his jacket pocket, officers quickly grabbed and handcuffed him. They searched him and found, among other things, a loaded .32 revolver, a flick knife and CS gas canisters. He was wearing surgical gloves and a radio transmitter. Mr. Barrett attempted to drive away in the blue van, but he was pursued and caught. When he saw that he was surrounded, he got out of the van, put his hands in the air and said, "Enough is enough." The two security guards were found hooded and lying face down on the floor of the security van. Mr. Turner's wrists were tightly bound with plastic ties, while his colleague wore handcuffs. Although it was plain that Mr. Turner was acting in concert with Mr. Barrett and Mr. Croke, the police did not know at this stage whether the second guard was involved. Inside the shoebox was gold bullion worth £283,000. The four men were taken to Milton Keynes police station, where they were detained incommunicado because the police needed to visit certain addresses in search of evidence before anyone was alerted to the arrests. At 2 p.m, officers arrived at Emerald just as Rita Croke was getting into her car. They arrested her and searched the car. Inside were two bags. One contained a Rec .65 handgun, 1 bullet, gas pellets, shotgun cartridges, spectacles, correspondence and adhesive. The other contained a holster, a bullet, hats and clothing. Rita, too, was taken to Milton Keynes police station and charged initially with conspiracy to rob. It turned out that Alan Turner had worked for Shield since the 1st of July 1986 and was the son of Rita Croke. He was charged with robbery and firearms offences. The other guard was entirely innocent. Attention now centred on Donald Barrett. The flying squad suspected that the gang had been involved with other similarly planned robberies, but without his help, it was going to be difficult for them to prove this. So Detective Constable Kevin Shapland and another officer went to Mr. Barrett's cell and began to plant in his mind the notion that he might care to turn Supergrass a second time, something that had never happened before in criminal history. Before any suspect is taken on as a Supergrass, the police have to ask the permission of the Crown Prosecution Service, and then adhere to rigorous procedures. In 1978, a special police protection squad was set up to look after Supergrasses, who, having appeared as key witnesses in criminal trials, have to be provided with new identities to safeguard their lives. The first such case was that of Derek Crichton Bertie Smalls, an armed robber from North London who helped to jail 27 bank robbers for a total of 315 years in a series of trials at the Old Bailey. Since then, new identities have been granted in 170 cases, about 700 people when family members are included. The complexity of the subterfuge involved is little understood. The cooperation of up to 30 organisations is needed to make a single new identity safe. False documents must be obtained to cover educational qualifications, insurance, employment and medical histories, pension rights, bank accounts, mortgages, and in many cases, social security benefits. It was clear from the beginning that Donald Barrett was very anxious about what was going to happen to him. When he came to serve his sentence eventually, what truly safe prison accommodation could be found for him? He'd served his previous sentence at the Supergrass wing at Bedford Prison. Having grassed hardened criminals before, he would be in danger unless he was put in a protected prison wing again. It was also of concern to Donald Barrett that in the past he had spoken at length to David Croke about his previous appearance for the Crown and his subsequent reduced prison sentence. Mr. Croke had asked him many questions about his treatment both before and after he turned Supergrass. Now Barrett was desperate to get in first, before David Croke could volunteer his services. So he agreed to cooperate with the police without delay. A statement was taken from Mr. Barrett outlining the cases with which he felt he could assist the police. The statement was taken without prejudice, which means that he was not cautioned when he gave the information, and it could not be used against him in court. Detective Chief Superintendent Gwynne passed it on to the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Crown Prosecution Service, so that Mr. Barrett's status as a resident informant, or Supergrass, could be considered. It was a difficult time for the investigating team, as no one thought that Donald Barrett would be granted permission to appear for the Crown a second time. But they were fortunate. He was, in the end, granted resident informant status. Once the decision had been taken, Mr. Barrett was moved from Milton Keynes to a secure police station in East London. One requirement of evidence furnished by a Supergrass is that it must be corroborated by supporting testimony. So a special incident room was set up, and 12 detectives began to re-investigate the events, evidence and criminals about which Barrett was providing information. He was interviewed daily by 2 officers. What quickly became apparent was the meticulous planning that had been necessary before any of the robberies could be carried out. In the Shields case, it turned out that the depot had in fact been the main target for a future robbery that needed careful planning. But as Alan Turner had only recently joined the company, the team had been aiming to wait a few months before setting a final date for the raid. When Alan Turner discovered that he was going to be driving a security van full of gold bullion, the gang, led by David Croke, decided that it would be an easy target. Mr. Turner had driven this route once before, and was told only a few days in advance that he'd be making another trip. Contrary to their usual practice, the gang's plans had to be prepared in haste. This explained why Mr. Barrett left with his family for Portugal. The holiday had already been arranged. He was hoping to rejoin them the day after the robbery. It was ironic that after all their careful preparation for the other robberies, their desire to earn a quick buck proved disastrous for them. It seemed that David Croke was the brains behind the criminal team. Donald Barrett had known him for about 2 years. Mr. Croke was quite happy to work with Mr. Barrett, even though he had turned Supergrass in 1980. In fact, the whole team regarded him as particularly safe, as they felt he could never be granted Supergrass status again. Croke and Barrett had a mutual friend, George Ince, and it's likely that they were introduced by him. Mr. Ince and Mr. Barrett were the same age, had grown up together, and were both well-known East End villains. Although Mr. Barrett linked Mr. Ince with several of the crimes that he himself had committed, the police were unable to find independent corroboration. As a result, Mr. Ince was arrested but later released, and all charges against him were dropped. In the first few days after the arrests, the scene, the suspects and the vehicles used in the robbery were examined. Searches were made of premises belonging to the suspects and evidence collated. Along with several other crimes, Mr. Barrett admitted to the armour guard robbery, which had taken a year to plan. He told the interviewing officers, "On Wednesday, Thursday and Friday, David Croke used to go out looking for security vans. He saw an armour guard vehicle doing a delivery and followed it back to the depot. He realised it was a fairly small depot. He'd seen 3 or 4 security vans outside and wanted to know if there were any more inside, plus how many staff and a general idea of how they performed. The next morning I went there in a motor car with Dave in the boot with holes in for him to see what was going on. This was done for 6 weeks. During this time we got to know the key holders, Bill and Joe. The team researched Bill for several months. They found out where he lived and what shifts he worked, and they unearthed details about his family. Then, when they learned that he had young children, who could threaten the secrecy of the plan, they felt, they turned their attention to the other key holder, Joe. After that robbery, David Croke flew out to Malta, where he owned a flat and a boat, which he renamed Armagh. Acting on this information, the police flew to Malta and found the boat, which had been subsequently repainted and renamed. However, under ultraviolet light, the boat's former name was clearly visible. Corroboration also came from forensic evidence. During the armour guard robbery, a chain-link fence was cut within the perimeter of the premises. When the police searched Mr. Croke's house, Emerald, some months later, they found a pair of wire cutters on whose cutting edge were marks that corresponded exactly to the cut marks on the wire. Also, a balaclava was left at the scene, and when Mr. Croke was arrested on the M1, he was wearing a wig, hairs from which matched fibres found on the balaclava. The third member of the gang who committed that crime, implicated by Mr. Barrett, was a Glenn Armsby, who lived with Rita Croke's daughter. Mr. Barrett told the police, "Both Dave and Glenn opened a number of accounts in building societies to put their share in. But after coming back from Malta, Dave transferred his money to the Bank of Ireland, because he said he was getting a better rate of interest there." Mr. Barrett went on to give further details about Mr. Croke's financial affairs, including the precise amount each of them got when the proceeds of the crime were shared. He said that Mr. Croke received £140,000 for the armour guard job. His account at the Bank of Ireland was in the name of T. Moore, and he had paid Donald Barrett cheques drawn on this account. Police recovered from Emerald a briefcase that belonged to Mr. Croke. It contained a great deal of correspondence bearing the names T. Moore and David Croke. Further evidence supplied by the bank, statements, paying-in slips, cheques, corroborated everything that Mr. Barrett had said. From this wealth of information, police were able to prepare a graph of Mr. Croke's finances, which exposed a sum of £140,000 in his account shortly after the armour guard robbery. This revealed the very different ways in which Mr. Barrett and Mr. Croke spent the proceeds of their crimes. Mr. Croke was the investor, while Mr. Barrett, who lived in a council-owned house, spent his share on holidays, clothes and expensive meals. He bought his suits from Savile Row. Indeed, it was a standing joke among the police team that he spent more on a tie and a handkerchief than they spent on an entire suit. Mr. Barrett admitted the robbery in Tottenham at the Hops warehouse and implicated Armsby and Croke in this crime too. He said, "We saw the gateman arrive, and after about 5 or 10 minutes we went in. Dave went into the tea room and laid out a bomb which he had made up. It consisted of a box with a strap and contained workings he'd bought from a model shop and a shotgun cartridge which had had the shot removed. 2 guards came into the office, which took us by surprise, as on all the occasions we'd watched, there'd only been one. We took them into the tea room, where Dave showed one of the guards how the device worked by remote control. We then strapped it onto the spine of the older guard. As Dave was coming out of the van, the manager arrived in a Vauxhall. I went over to him and told him to get out. He refused, so I fired a shot into the ground. Because of the noise, 3 people came out of the storage area. Glenn went towards them, and meanwhile I took the manager into the toilets. While I was there, I heard another gun go off, which I later discovered was Dave's shotgun, which was cocked. I came back out, and Dave told us to go. He had put the money into the back of the gateman's car. We had taken the keys from him earlier. Glenn got in that car with Dave, and I took the manager's car so I could block the road if anyone came after us. We went to the garages where the marina was and transferred the money. Dave drove off in the marina, and Glenn and I walked further down the road to where I had left my car. We then met back at Dave's house and shared the money out. We got £30,000 each, and the bags containing the money were later burned. Again, his information about how the money was shared out was supported by David Croke's bank account. In total, Donald Barrett admitted 23 offences. He gave information relating to crimes that had not been linked with the men in custody, including robberies in Greenwich and Bristol. And he was asked to describe scenes and events so that the investigators could attempt to identify areas of potential corroboration. Mr. Barrett was interviewed for nearly 9 months and was then remanded in custody on a special Supergrass wing before the case finally came to court. Detective Constable Kevin Shapland was in constant contact with him. Over the months, he said, I got to know Donald Barrett very well, and although he was a dangerous criminal, I had a degree of professional regard for him. He chain-smoked, but drank very little. He was a Jekyll and Hyde character. One side revealed the charming family man who was kind and considerate, while the other showed this incredibly ruthless man who would stop at nothing for his gains. Mr. Barrett was concerned about the first part of his cross-examination in court, because details of his own past, the crimes he had committed, would emerge. He had 15 previous convictions, the first of which he had acquired when he was just 12 years old. Many of the crimes of which he had been convicted were very serious indeed, possessing firearms with intent to commit robbery, wounding with intent, and assaults on the police. And he was rightly anxious that the court might lack sympathy for him. During the trial, he was escorted from his cell by Detective Constable Shapland, who remembered, "He was very nervous for the first few days. His only concern was what kind of sentence he would get. We had asked him to confront David Croke and Glenn Armsby before the trial because we felt it would help prepare him. In fact, he spoke very well in court." David Croke refused to answer any questions about the charges being levelled against him. Indeed, the only words he uttered throughout the interviews were, "I want my solicitor to be here." Yet he pleaded guilty to 9 offences because of the strong evidence against him. These included the Tottenham, Armagard and Shields robberies. He was sentenced to a total of 23 years imprisonment. Although Glenn Armsby admitted the Tottenham robbery in interview, the police concentrated their efforts on getting a conviction for the most serious case, the Armagard robbery. For this, he was sentenced to a total of 15 years in prison. Alan Turner was sentenced to 7 years imprisonment, and Rita Croke received a suspended sentence. Police officers went into the witness box to give the court an insight into the help that Mr. Barrett had given them, after which the judge mulled over an appropriate sentence for 24 hours. The next day, Donald Barrett received his sentence, 16 years imprisonment, which was reduced to 12 on appeal. The police thought this very fair. Mr. Barrett has been serving the first part of his sentence in the Supergrass wing at Reading Prison. For the rest of his time, he'll be placed in a protected prison wing. The hours of dedication put in by the whole inquiry team had finally paid off. And for Detective Constable Shapland, it was a great personal success. He said at the time, "All this came about because of one perceptive 14-year-old boy who, by a quirk of fate, had watched a video of Crimewatch. Without his information, I have no doubt that this team would have carried on and committed many more major crimes." End of Side 3.